Hi everyone, I'm excited to share with you the first of what will be a 5-part video series for me, diving deep into Marvel Champions strategy and theory. Now, if you know anything about my channel, it's that I play primarily on heroic difficulty. I'm not explicitly calling this this video series a heroic guide, since I truly believe the best strategy is the best strategy regardless of the difficulty played. But if you want to think of it as a heroic guide, I won't necessarily stop you. I made my YouTube channel to serve in part as a source of competitive style content for Marvel Champions. Obviously, Champions is a cooperative game and is very fun from the standpoint of storytelling, creative expression, and socialization. But my orientation towards the game has always been more about competing against the game and competing against myself to get as good at the game as I can be. And so, while I still have a lot to learn myself, I do think that my approach to the game, my body of work beating scenarios on heroic difficulty, and the ways I like to dissect the game using numbers and statistics hopefully gives me some credibility to speak on how we can improve our strategy and win more games and, by extension, have more fun because, after all, it's fun to win. So I mentioned this is the first of a 5-part video series. I'm planning to do videos on card evaluation, this one, hero evaluation, deck evaluation, scenario evaluation, and then bring it all together with gameplay evaluation. This series, it'll be my comprehensive strategy guide to all things Marvel Champions. If you can't tell already, I'm actually scripting out this entire video because I don't want to forget to say anything. So I apologize if it comes off a bit rehearsed, but I do want these 5 videos to capture everything I say, at least at a high level, on strategy and theory in Marvel Champions. Maybe we'll still do some more specific topics over the years, but this will be my sort of primary strategy guide series to my channel, which, like as I mentioned, is focused on advanced gameplay. You can find the transcript of this video in the description in case you prefer the written content to the audio for one reason or another. So my goal in this video and in this series is to present material in a way that's applicable to all player counts, all game modes, though I will mention, like I said, most of the games I play are solo on heroic difficulty. But many of the concepts I discuss, they're not going to change if the game is solo or multiplayer in general, but I'll do my best to call out wherever there may be a difference between the two. I also intend the series to cover all difficulties, standard, expert, heroic, etc. Now, in the easier formats, there's certainly a lower bar to clear for power level in order to consistently win games, but ultimately to get as high a win rate as possible. I think the principles are the same regardless of the difficulty played. So without further ado, let's get into the topic of today's video, card evaluation. I wanted to start with card evaluation because it's the smallest, finite unit of the game that really makes sense to talk about. Once we talk about cards, we'll have a better sense of how to evaluate a hero and its 15 identity-specific cards, a deck and its 40 to 50 cards, gameplay using those cards, etc. I'm going to define 4 metrics that I'll use to talk about cards: efficiency, flexibility, speed, and loss mitigation. So I'll talk about each one individually first, and then we'll talk about how we use them together to analyze the different card types in the game. So efficiency is something you've likely heard of before. If you've looked at other strategy content, I'm not inventing that here, but I do want this to be a comprehensive video, so I'll dig into it again here. Efficiency means the ratio of the effect a card gives us to the cost of the card. When we play a card from hand, we also add 1 to the printed cost to get what's called an effective cost, which accounts for the fact that the played card came out of the same pool of potential resources as the actual spent resources. Keep in mind, some cards will have an additional cost in the text box, like discarding an ally, which those types of things need to be accounted for in addition to the printed resource cost. If we look at a simple example like Uppercut, we spend 3 resources, or 4 effective resources, including the card. I might later call this ER, abbreviated to ER, effective resources. We spend the 4 ER to deal 5 damage. This is an efficiency of 5 divided by 4, or 1.25 damage per resource. If we look at a different card, Haymaker, this is as a printed cost of 2, so an effective cost of 3. It does 3 damage for an efficiency of 3 divided by 3, or 1 damage per resource. Here we can see that Haymaker has worse efficiency than Uppercut. And we can do the same for thwart events. If we look at chase them down, we have a 1-cost card that removes 2 threat for an efficiency of 2 threat per resource. Hopefully the reason we look at efficiency rather than total effect or total cost is clear enough to see. There's no difference between spending a 3 effective cost card to do 6 damage compared to spending 3 copies of a 1 cost card that does 2 damage. If we have finite resources on a turn, we want as much as effect as possible. If we know the effect we want to get it as cheaply as possible. So efficiency just ties us together more neatly, looking at the calculated ratio of the effect to the cost in order to allow us to compare cards to one another. Requires a little bit of math, but it's a good way to compare different cards in apples to apples fashion. We'll talk later in the video about the efficiency I think we should aim for or to use as our baseline when evaluating cards to put in our decks. So the true measure of success in Marvel Champions, though, it's not just how efficient our individual cards are, but how much we're able to do on any given turn, how efficient our turns are, especially relative to the villain phase. And so the net difference between our turn and the villain turn is how we sort of hope to gain momentum in the game. And that leads me to talk about flexibility. So I define flexibility as a card's ability to give us the most efficient turns possible, which I hope to demonstrate is a unique category from a card's standalone efficiency. Because let's say we have a 6-card hand filled with uppercuts, and just ignore for now, we can only play 3 copies of a card. It'll make my point clear enough. Since uppercut has an effective cost of 4, we can only play 1 uppercut from this hand, so we'll do a total of 5 damage with this turn. Now consider a hand filled with 6 copies of Haymaker. This card costs 3, so we can actually play 2 of them from our 6-card hand, doing a total of 6 damage. So even though we saw Uppercut is a more efficient card than Haymaker, in the handful of uppercuts, we effectively waste 2 resources from not being able to use our whole hand. So we end up having to discard these at end of turn if we want, or we keep them in hand and draw 2 fewer cards at the end of the player phase. So we waste that value. And this is, of course, a contrived example, but it demonstrates, I hope, how card efficiency and turn efficiency are not quite the same thing. In general, flexibility will come from cards being cheaper, like we saw in Haymaker versus Uppercut. Drawing cards also represents flexibility. It gives you more combinations of cards to play that can help you craft an efficient turn. Cards with multiple effects also fit under flexibility, of course. That might have been the typical sense we would talk about a card's flexibility. But cards with multiple effects, so how I think about them is they mitigate the negative value that can occur when you're forced to leave a negative encounter card in play for extra turns, so a side scheme or a minion. If we have a hand that's super efficient at dealing damage, but we need to thwart for 5 to remove a hazard icon in play, the net result of our turn will be whatever we do with our cards, we do some damage, minus whatever the negative value of that encounter card we draw is because we left this hazard icon in play. So we might be incentivized to play cards in our deck that can thwart or attack or block, whatever it is, in order to avoid this kind of negative value, even if that comes at a little bit of a dip in efficiency. So basic spell, this is sort of a perfect example of a card here with multiple effects. I don't love the efficiency with either effect, but because it's flexible, it can still be a worthwhile card to play in some contexts. Allies are great at this as well. We'll talk plenty more about allies later. So flexibility is a great upside for a card to have, but ultimately I think it's less important than individual card efficiency because of how the game engine in Marvel Champions gives us lots of flexibility already. So cards have the option to be played as what the card is or used as resources to play other cards, which is already inherently flexible. We draw 5 or 6 cards every round, always gives us lots of options to do what's best on any given turn. And kind of a sort of a mathy example here, again, sort of simplified, but if we have a 6-card hand and every card has a printed cost of 2 resources, or effective cost of 3, there are 15 different combinations of cards we could play on our turn. We also have our identity card, which lets us attack, thwart, defend, or recover. Lots of flexibility there. Those are 4 different options. And if we multiply that 15 options from our hand times the 4 from our identity, we get 60 different options of what to do on this turn with a handful of these 2-cost cards and a ready hero. So kind of a high number, might surprise you a little bit. Gets amplified even more in multiplayer, right? We've got 4 players instead of 1 6-card hand and 1 identity. We've got 4 6-card hands, 4 identities. Using this mathematically convenient example that I've set up so far, we have 60 times 60 times 60 times 60 options, 60 to the power of 4 options for how we conduct that turn, which is over 12 million possible turns that we could craft in this 4-player game scenario. So again, somewhat a contrived example, but not every card is going to be playable, but my point is basically there's lots of ways to conduct any given turn because of that ability to use cards as resources or as the cards themselves. The upshot of this is we would rather play a collection of highly efficient cards and use the flexibility the game gives us to craft optimal turns, rather than play a bunch of flexible but inefficient cards. Because even those efficient but narrow cards, right, we can still just spend them as a resource for a different efficient card that fits the game state better, whether it's a minion or a side scheme, whatever we have to do. We will run into problems, and I'll talk about this later, if we start to play too many highly inflexible cards in our decks. And indeed, as we'll see, a lot of the most efficient cards that we'd like to play tend to have some small specific condition they need to meet. So if we run too high a density of these inflexible cards, we can definitely run into some problems. And I'll dive deeper into this balance between efficiency and flexibility in my hero and deck building evaluation videos. But we'll move on for now to my 3rd metric for card evaluation, which is a card's speed. So this is how many turns does it take us to be satisfied with the value from a card. Speed can be a mitigating factor to a card's efficiency by requiring many turns to pass before a card gives us an acceptable value. So in general, the faster a card pays us back, the better, because that allows us to answer immediate threats and not accumulate negative value like I mentioned from those encounter cards in play. An example to illustrate this would be Beat Cop. Beat Cop removes 1 threat per turn, but indefinitely, just stays in play. You can do that forever. So say after 100 turns, this is a 4-cost card that removes 100 threat. This is crazy efficiency. But of course, it took 100 turns to do that. If the turn we have Beat Cop in hand that we want to play it, we get hit with a must-clear side scheme with the hazard icon. And Beat Cop is our threat removal card that we chose to play on our deck. That's what we have in hand. That's going to look pretty awkward. We can only chip 1 away. We're going to get a lot of negative value from leaving that side scheme in play. So we'd much rather have a card in this instance like For Justice, which certainly has a lower efficiency potential, but gives you 4 threat removal immediately, thus avoiding the negative value that might come from a side scheme, which counteracts any efficiency in a card like Beat Cop. A similar card to Beat Cop, but for damage, would be Yondu. He can deal 1 damage a turn indefinitely, but say a must-kill minion comes out, it's going to activate against you multiple times before Yondu himself can defeat it. We might bring efficiency into this discussion on a turn-by-turn basis to better evaluate a card like this. So for example, over a 1-turn window, Yondu costs 5 from hand and does 1 damage for a terrible efficiency of 0.2 damage per resource, right? Obviously, we're not going to play Yondu for just the turn he comes in. After 5 turns, he's done 5 damage, so still for 5 resources, so his efficiency is 1 damage per resource. After 10 turns, we're looking at 2 damage per resource, which is much better. So we can do this math to see how many turns Yondu needs to be in play to reach whatever our acceptable efficiency is. If that answer is 8 turns, well, the game might not last 8 more turns, depending on when we draw Yondu, so it'll never be worth it to play from hand. Of course, Yondu, I won't go on a tangent on Yondu here, but there's other reasons to play Yondu, but just demonstrating my point of kind of looking at efficiency over turns as maybe a substitute to accommodate some of this speed factor into a card. We can also frame this as a tension between value and tempo. So tempo is a word that gets used a lot when talking about gameplay. A card has good tempo when its value is front-loaded towards giving us immediate impact on the board. It's similar actually to what I discussed when talking about flexible cards. We might sacrifice some efficiency in order to be able to thwart or attack. We might also sacrifice some efficiency in order to front load a card's value to help us answer an immediate threat, like I talked about with For Justice. So other cards might have high value but poor tempo. These cards like Beat Cop and Yondu, they're certainly more total value per resource potentially at the end of the game, which this is still very important for building long-term value, preparing for future threats. There's no blanket right or wrong for which we should prioritize, tempo or value. All depends on the situation. I just want to recognize there's usually a trade-off between these two things, and this is how I'll often talk about cards, where they fall on this spectrum. I also want to acknowledge at this point, if the best play for you to make at any state in the game, you might think, this is kind of an inefficient play. If it's the best play for you to make, it's still your best play. When we're evaluating cards, when we're talking about these things, efficiency, flexibility, speed, it's really sort of a pre-game thought process. It's what we're planning on doing. The cards we're choosing to play in our deck before the game begins, so that in the middle of the game, when more specific circumstances come up, our options look as good as possible because we've included the best cards in the deck, right? Throughout the whole video series, there's never a single rule that's going to cover every situation, but this is just how I like to sort of think about cards, think about my decks as I'm getting ready for advanced games. The last metric I want to talk about is what I call loss mitigation. It's a bit of a separate thing. Those efficiency, flexibility, and speed all sort of tie into each other. They compete against each other. Loss mitigation is kind of a separate thing. It basically recognizes that all the efficiency in the world might not stop us from simply losing the game in certain situations, right? We want to get as much value from our cards as possible, but we need to stay alive in order to keep playing the game. One way we can lose is from the main scheme advancing to threat. So, Rhino is a classic example where you can remove threat from the main scheme super efficiently, but it has a really low threshold of 7. So you end the turn in alter ego form, draw 2 or 3 boost icons, hit an advance, draw 2 or 3 more boost icons, and boom, the game is just over. So this makes a card like Under Surveillance extremely valuable on this loss mitigation axis, especially in solo. I guess it's not as big a deal in multiplayer. But this just sort of takes one way for you to lose the game off the table while you progress towards a victory with your other cards. We could say the same for attacks. Having an ally around to block is always nice. A lot of scenario-specific silver bullets can fit into this category as well. In my high-difficulty games, I love to play cards like this, like Enraged against Sandman, and Target Acquired against Venom to stop this particular boost card that turns the attack into overkill. These types of cards, they just do something against the scenario that doesn't really fit neatly into an efficiency argument, but I still think of them as really valuable because of the particular things about the scenario, what the scenario throws at you. And so I know not everyone likes to tailor decks that way, but I like to see the value when I see that in a card. So I'm going to start talking about the different card types next. But first I want to talk about just what is the efficiency I expect from cards, because this also gets a little different when we talk about the different card types. So one of the things that makes it possible to even talk about efficiency so much is that there are relatively few different abilities that cards can actually have in Marvel Champions. It's a relatively simple game, at least compared to stuff like Arkham or Magic the Gathering. The ones we generally care about, and this covers maybe 99% of cards, right? Dealing damage, removing threat, applying a status, so either to counter villain activation with a stun or confuse, applying a tough to ourselves, kind of stops an attack, healing, and then just making more resources. This covers pretty much every card in the game. So if we establish a baseline for what efficiencies we should have for these effects, or what's available to us, we can compare lots of cards at once. So for damage, I aim for 2 damage per resource spent. For thwarting, it's 2 threat removed per resource spent. Countering a villain action, either with that stun or confuse, comes at about 2 resources. Healing is kind of a weird one. The best way to heal is just to prevent damage to begin with, blocking with allies generally. So there's very few cards that actually heal when you just look at the cards in the game. So I'll say about 2 points of healing per resource spent. Say blocking a villain attack, I said that's worth about 2 resources. That might prevent about 4 damage on average. If we think of our identity exhausting as 1 resource worth with either 2 attack or 2 thwart, we could also be recovering usually for 3, even maybe 3 or 4. So maybe healing even comes at a little more than 2 points of healing per resource when we factor readying in that way. But it's honestly, I won't evaluate too many cards with healing because there's just not that many in the game. All right, the reason I use these numbers as my baseline is because these efficiencies are abundantly available in the form of allies. So let's talk about allies as our first card type. A typical ally will look something like this. Here's Eros, Deadpool, and Scarlet Spider. These allies all demonstrate what I call baseline efficiency for allies. If we break down the Deadpool ally as an example, even ignoring the text box for now, he has an effective cost of 4, right? 3 plus the card. Those first 2 hit points can each be spent to do 2 thwart or 2 attack, worth 1 resource each. Then we can block using the last hit point at a value of 2 resources, totaling up to the 4 we paid in Deadpool's cost. If we look at Eros, he has a weaker attack stat, but as long as one of the thwart and attack stat has a value of 2, we can still reach this same efficiency. Eros' effective cost is 3, 1 goes to thwart for 2, 2 goes for a block. Scarlet Spider is the same, but with an attack stat of 2. So for the 5 resource investment, we get 6 damage worth 3 resources and a block that's worth 2. As a quick check for meeting baseline efficiency to save some of this math, all an ally needs is you need hit points equal to the printed cost, and then a thwart or attack stat of 2, of course, with 1 consequential damage. Of course, once we add back in the value from the text box of an ally, allies can even exceed this baseline efficiency that I've established. In addition to being the most efficient cards in the game, allies are inherently flexible, right? Even if the best value for Scarlet Spider is to attack for 2 over and over again, it's obviously upside to have the ability to thwart for 1 if that would help you clear a hazard icon, clear some side scheme in play. Allies with thwart and attack of 2, like Deadpool, are obviously very flexible. They maintain their efficiency within their flexibility. The main downside of an ally is that they can be a bit slow, taking a few turns to use up their hit points to reach the full value. But even just a 2-cost ally with 2 HP, right, activate right away, block in the next villain phase, we've got our value back in just a single turn cycle, which is as fast as you can get. And lastly, all allies help on the loss mitigation front, like I mentioned, due to having that ability to block, even in case of an emergency, even if we have to use it inefficiently when there's still hit points remaining that we could get value out of. It's obviously better to block than to die on the spot. So allies are just phenomenal cards. It's kind of an unfortunate part of the game that if we want to build the best deck possible, we usually just play a boatload of allies. But we do run into some diminishing returns due to the ally limit of 3. So again, we'll talk more about kind of how many you should play in possibly a future video. But for now, allies are extremely good, as I'm sure you probably know already. The next card type I'll talk about is events. Events are typically higher tempo plays. You get all their value immediately when the card is played, but they might not reach the efficiency ceiling of allies, upgrades, and supports. I mentioned earlier that we usually have a trade-off between the efficiency of cards and the narrowness of conditions you need to meet to get their full value. And we can start to see this with some examples. The cards I mentioned earlier, Uppercut and Haymaker, they're very inefficient, but they can target anything, which is nice sometimes. If we compare to the cards Relentless Assault and Take That, we see a more specific condition we need to achieve to use these cards, but their efficiency is much greater. And I really value this efficiency, like I said earlier, even if it comes with some conditionals because of that flexibility in the game already. I'd rather still play cards with higher upside and then craft my deck around meeting those conditions necessary to play the cards, rather than play inefficient cards with broader use cases. Though, as always, there's going to be exceptions to these kinds of heuristics. Before I move away from events, I just want to highlight some of my favorites in the different aspects that meet my baseline efficiency and most often justify their inclusion alongside allies in our high-power decks. In Justice, we have Clear the Area, which is 2 threat removal for 1 net resource, assuming we draw a card with it, which is very easy to do in solo at least. Multitasking, 4 threat for 2 resources, as long as there's 2 different schemes in play, we need to spend a mental resource. So this one's actually a little better in multiplayer then. Turn the Tide actually has incredible efficiency, one of the best efficiencies in the game, at 3 damage per resource. In Aggression, we have Skilled Strike, 2 damage for 1 resource. Chase Them Down, 2 threat for 1 resource. You'll Pay for That, a card that I can often remove 4, maybe even more threat for just 2 resources. Protections, efficient cards are mostly defenses. It does have Hard Knocks, which meets my target with 2 resources for blocking an attack with the Tough and 2 resources for 4 damage. Some examples of defenses I like are Jump Flip, which prevents about a resource of damage, does about 1 resource of threat removal. Never Back Down cancels a future activation, so that's worth about 2 resources. Gives a little extra damage prevention on top of that. Defenses definitely suffer from flexibility, which makes them far better in multiplayer. We could spend a whole video on defenses in the future. Just understand for now that they are typically fairly efficient, but when the source of their efficiency overlaps so much with what makes allies great, it can sometimes be hard to justify them from a flexibility standpoint, especially if we're playing in solo or only 2-hand maybe. I'm actually going to skip leadership for now. Leadership doesn't have many attacks or thwarts, since it's the aspect that's all about allies. So where we do see efficiency in leadership events, this tends to come from ally healing, which I'll spend some more time on actually later in the video. Ultimately, as I've discussed, efficiency is not the sole metric to evaluate these cards. There's plenty of reasons to play a card with suboptimal efficiency, but I'm always going to be drawn first towards these highest efficiency cards to see if I can justify playing them before moving on to lower efficiency, maybe more flexible cards. The next card type I'll talk about is upgrades and supports. Grouping these together, they're pretty similar in practice, sticking on the playing field after we play them. They're very diverse card types in general, but I'm focusing this discussion here on the ones that accumulate value over multiple turns, accumulate value over time. In most cases, upgrades and supports have higher efficiency potential than events, but they have much less tempo. It might take several turns for an upgrade to reach equivalent value to a similar costed event, but then that upgrade can continue being in play, sometimes indefinitely, and start to generate more total value than an event would. So we talked about this example with Beat Cop earlier, right? If you compare the core set cards, Uppercut and Tack Team, designers knew this, right away with the game. Uppercut has more value up front, 5 damage the turn you play it, compared to Tack Team only doing 2. But Tack Team has more total effect overall. It can do 6 total damage once you've used it 3 times. A card like Combat Training is similar to the ones we discussed earlier, like Yondu in a way. Sorry, I'm using so many aggression cards, but there's lots of good aggression card examples. Combat Training can contribute 1 damage a turn forever, for as long as we're attacking. It needs 3 turns to reach the same value as Haymaker, but over a long game, the damage can keep adding up and just be tremendously efficient. These upgrades and supports, it's not really useful to make a list like I did with events of the ones that can hit efficiency, because the truth is a lot of them can hit really good efficiency. It just takes that time to get there. I should also say, I guess, it's not really a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing that upgrades and supports create value on a delay as opposed to events. If it's turn 1 of the game, or it's a turn where there isn't anything for us to clear, maybe the villain just attacked with an assault, we've got kind of an open board. Upgrades, supports, they let us invest resources now to generate more value in future turns so that we're better equipped to handle future threats as they appear. We're less likely to get overwhelmed from a single bad turn from like an under fire, for example, from the encounter deck. And of course, allies do this too, right? It's always the answer, just allies are good at everything. So for these upgrades and supports, if they give us this indefinite damage or threat removal over time, the more practical efficiency calculation is one that looks like what we did earlier, the accumulated value as each turn goes by. Like we did with Yondu, this might be a bit more practical way to think about some of these cards. We can also see with upgrades and supports something that hasn't come up yet this video, but is a very big part of the game, which is cards that generate more resources. This is obviously a great effect, right? The more resources we have access to, the more cards we can play, the more total effect we can have on our turn. But just like other upgrades, we can judge resource generators based on how long it takes for us to get paid back our value, because in the case of upgrades and supports, right, we never get all our value back right away. How long does it actually take for us to be satisfied with that? Although it is a direct resource calculation now, we don't have to sort of have a baseline efficiency ratio we're looking for. So in general, it's just always better to have cheaper resource generators. If we just take an example, if we look at a card like Avengers Mansion, this takes 5 turns to pay back the initial value, right? Costs 5 effective resources, draw a card every turn, that takes 5 turns to pay back. Then after that, turn 6 and beyond, we start making a profit. This isn't to say that Avengers Mansion is a bad card if we only use it 2 or 3 times before the game ends. It's just that we'd prefer to have played a different card, which would have given us more total value over a 2 to 3 turn window, as maybe an ally or an event would. And so if we anticipate this happening a lot with our deck, right, if we can't afford to play a 5-cost card the first few turns of the game, whenever we might have room to play it, the game's only going to last 3-4 more turns, that would tell us just not to play Avengers Mansion at all. So as with events, right, the more restrictions that are replaced on our resource generators, that's usually what ends up making them cheaper. So Avengers Mansion is kind of the most expensive, but also the most generic and flexible resource we can get, right? Drawing a card, we can always draw a card, and it gives us a resource to spend or another card to play, so it's really good flexibility. But if we consider this chain of going from Avengers Mansion to Helicarrier, now it's 1 cost cheaper, but it doesn't draw a card, but it is still just kind of a general purpose resource. Look at Sense of Justice, it costs 1 more or less, but can only be used to play thwart cards. Deft Focus, even more narrow, can only play superpower cards. At each stage, the usefulness of the resource, or I guess I should say the broadness of how much it can pay for, gets restricted, but the cost of the card goes down, which is very good to play resource generators as cheap as possible. So just as I look to the most efficient events first to see if I can justify them, we look first to the cheapest resource generators that we can justify in our deck. Right, it's very often correct, possibly always correct, to play some number of resource generators in a deck, but they have diminishing returns. Just like any card type, we need to actually do stuff with our resources at some point. If there's cheaper options that fit into our hero or deck strategy, we should make sure we include those first before using those more expensive options like Helicarrier or Avengers Mansion. Cheap resource generators are so powerful, in fact, that we'll often build our deck around them. We'll play more cards in our deck because we have this cheap resource generator that can pay for them. So in a Sense of Justice deck, we play a few more thwart events. Or if we want to play a team-building exercise deck, we might pick our allies to be ones that share traits with our hero. But even if a deck can't play any of these cheap ones, it's still really usually worth it to play a few of the expensive resource generators because of just how strong it is to make resource generators every turn. Maybe I'll repeat that in the deck building evaluation video, but certainly you don't need me to tell you, cheap resource generators, very good. Better than more expensive resource generators, as long as we feel good about the density of cards in our deck that can be played with them. So if an event is a sped up version of a damage dealing or threat removing upgrade, then a resource card is the sped up version of a resource generating upgrade. We all know cards like Energy, Genius, and Strength, the Power-ofs, any multi-resource cards. These are extremely valuable cards because they increase our total resources available per turn at 0 additional cost. It's just in our hand, boom, resources, completely free. Other resource cards like Innovation or Audacity, they might not generate extra resources per se, but by giving a bonus effect when spent normally, they add a free value to our turns, which is very strong as well. Where resource cards can be criticized is in their flexibility. And this is a pretty big deal, right? Every card in Champions, we talked about the huge flexibility between being played as a card or being spent as a resource. Resource cards are only resources. So, right, if we have 1 or 2 every hand, that's perfect. We get some free value. But everyone knows what it feels like to draw a hand with 3, 4 resource cards, 1 cost card, and a 2 cost card you can't play, and a minion killing card with no minions. And then we are just driving ourselves crazy with these double resource cards. If only they had been some just crappy haymaker or something, we would have been able to play something on our turn. So all the individual card efficiency, card value in the world doesn't matter if at the end of the day our turns our turns have the potential to be bad. So whenever I talk about resource cards, I'm always going to give them really good reviews because of how good it is to get those extra resources, that free value. But we should be aware of these diminishing returns. If we play too many of them, right, we end up with these horrible turns with just nothing to do. So it won't really be a question of if we play resource cards in our deck most of the time. It's just which ones do we play? How many do we play? That'll depend a lot, of course, on the hero and on the deck. All right, so for the rest of the video, there's just a few miscellaneous topics I wanted to cover that might have been a bit too much of a tangent in my earlier segments. So I will just hit these one by one, but they do apply to a significant chunk of cards each. So the first topic is the one I referenced earlier. This is ally healing. So classic example being like first aid or med team. Ally healing tends to be very efficient, highly efficient, but pretty much offers 0 tempo. If you think about playing first aid on an ally with 2 thwart or 2 attack, you've paid 2 resources to let it activate twice more for 2, whichever thwart or attack you use, which this perfectly hits my baseline efficiency. The only issue is that you never get immediate value from a heal effect the turn you play it, because you're prolonging the number of turns you get to use that ally, who you can generally only use once per turn anyways. You also delay getting to use your ally to block, which is a big chunk of value that goes into the efficiency of allies. So you're kicking that efficiency down the road. I still play ally healing effects somewhat regularly because I love cards with that high efficiency ceiling if I think it's justified in the deck or in the scenario. Just be aware that these effects, their value can be pretty slow, so just be aware of that. Kind of the opposite of ally healing is ally readying. So ally readying offers short-term tempo, but 0 added value. So your ally keeps the same hit points, which are kind of the currency of using your ally. Right, still takes consequential damage when you use it again that same turn, at least in most cases. So you speed up the lifespan of that ally, how many turns it takes to extract the value from that ally, but you're not actively creating more value in that ally in the way that ally healing is, because you free up that hit point again to spend in an activation. So there are some instances where ally readying generates positive value that we can look out for. Cards like Nick Fury or Professor X. Well, I say cards like, but it's really just Nick Fury and Professor X. These are allies that get discarded before they typically use their second hit point. I guess there's one more coming in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as well, Nick Fury Sr. But they almost never use their second hit point because they use their first the turn they come in, and then they're discarded at the end of turn. So readying those allies actually does produce a positive value. Allies with temporary buffs like Goliath, or allies that take no consequential damage like Yondu, also can turn readying effects into positive value plays. So there are several use cases for it, but I never play it for tempo alone, as it contributes no positive value over the lifetime of that ally if you're not healing it as well. And in fact has negative value in general because you're spending a resource or a card to play the readying effect. So not generally a strong ability, just be aware of that. All right, the next topic I want to go over is a mistake I sometimes see in the community and one I certainly sometimes make myself, which I call double counting. So double counting is when you evaluate the power of a card by implying the benefit from another card without considering that other card's cost. So it's probably best explained just with an example. Let's say we've got Hulk as our hero who has a base attack of 3 and a combat training attached. So over a 3-turn window, say we make 3 basic attacks and play 1 quick strike, which does damage equal to our hero's attack. If we calculate the individual efficiency of combat training, we might say it added 4 damage, 3 from boosted attacks and 1 from boosting the quick strike for 3 resources. If we calculate the individual efficiency of quick strike, we might say it did 4 damage, since that was our attack stat, for again 3 ER. So is the total effect 8 damage for 6 ER? Well, actually no. Quick strike did 4 damage. We attacked 3 more times with our buffed attack for 3 more damage. So we've only gotten 7 extra damage from these 2 effects. This is an example of double counting because when looking at the card's individual efficiencies, we counted the stat buff added to quick strike in both calculations. So this is why it can be better to look at total effect versus total cost when evaluating a combo of cards rather than the individual efficiencies. Now, this is a pretty minor example that demonstrates the case, but you can imagine taking this to the extreme. If you've got combat training, 3 copies of brute force, which adds +1 attack, maybe Hulk's hero upgrade with +1 attack, quick strike it can be 8 damage for 3 resources, which is a crazy efficient play. But no, you had to pay resources for each of those brute forces and the extra upgrade. So make sure you take all things like that into account when evaluating your efficiencies of combos. Another example it would be adding Gamora's extra damage and thwart from her hero ability into the efficiency of her events. I'm happy to do that for her events, but then if we go back and evaluate her hero form, we kind of assume that she doesn't have that ability. Or we can do it the other way. We can assume that by playing Gamora as our hero, we get some of this free value from her hero ability each turn, but then when we evaluate her events, we don't add back that efficiency. Now, ultimately, the truth is somewhere in between, but counting both at full value would be an example of double counting. Another category is assuming the benefits of resource generators in play, like saying, uppercut, it doesn't look very efficient at face value, but when you get a helicarrier and a quin carrier in play to start paying for some of those resources, now it gets insane efficiency. Now it's like only 2 resources for 5 damage. Well, yes, obviously if we take 1 or 2 resources off any card's cost, it's going to look incredible. But these are fungible resources that can pay for anything in our hand. It can pay for any card we want to play. So we still need to compare the individual value, the individual efficiency of uppercut with other options. We can't just imply a certain value from other cards in our deck into these cards. So just be careful when evaluating cards in conjunction with other cards. Look at what the card offers in isolation. And if you do want to calculate a combo with other cards, consider the total effect and total cost to avoid double counting. Or you can just kind of split the value. We could say in the quick strike example that combat training got an extra half point of damage over that 3-turn sequence. The quick strike gave us an extra half because ultimately they did combo together. But just be mindful of looking at total cost and total effect when evaluating cards. Another quick topic I want to hit is villain damage, such as in cards like Browbeat or Fighting Fit. These cards can sometimes have an acceptable efficiency if you just look at damage per resource, but the fact that they can only damage the villain and not minions is massive downside in flexibility and loss mitigation, right? Being able to kill minions so that they don't kill us. I place a really low value on these cards. You need some kind of extreme circumstance to want to play them in a deck for advanced scenarios. In a rush strategy, they might be justifiable, as most of your damage gets directed towards the villain anyways. But rush gets increasingly hard at higher difficulties, especially heroic. And so I'll talk about that a bit more in a future video. But my point here is just don't treat sort of villain damage with the same kind of efficiency mindset as we might think of generic damage, even to minions, because minions, help us not lose the game by when we can kill minions. All right, next I want to talk about resource sink cards. So these are cards like Plan B and Machine Man. These are cards that contribute a lot to flexibility by helping you use all your resources each turn. They have some ability that allows you to funnel resources into some effect. So in the case of Machine Man, I love Machine Man because he actually meets my baseline efficiency for allies. So he's totally fine to play just on his own, but he might also add a few extra points of value during the game from any excess resources you have in hand. So this isn't something, again, you should really plan to do, because he converts resources fairly inefficiently, one resource to one damage or thwart. But in those turns where you have a 1 or 2 resources left over, right, these are inevitable to a certain degree, he gives you a way to funnel that into some tangible value that you wouldn't otherwise get. Plan B, very similar, a little bit opposite actually. We pay 2 resources up front to do nothing, but then we get an efficient way to channel resources into damage each turn. If we're going to end the turn with 1 card left over, flip that into 2 damage. Makes our turns more efficient, even if the individual card isn't like stellar in terms of efficiency. So, right, these types of resource sinks, they do have some diminishing returns, because we should be building our deck to use all our resources efficiently as much as possible. We might sometimes still end up with 1 card left over, maybe 2, should almost never have 3 left over. So, having multiple cards like Machine Man and Plan B in play, they sort of fight each other for their role in the deck a bit. And likewise, we should never evaluate these cards as if those resources are just going to be free. Like, we shouldn't just price in free excess resources into these cards because, right, we still want to shoot for the most efficient, using all our cards each turn possible kind of strategies. But, right, this is value in several cards that exist. So I just want to give that a call out. So that's actually all the topics I wanted to cover in today's video. So to summarize, we talked about 4 different things to look at when evaluating cards: efficiency, flexibility, speed/tempo, and loss mitigation. These qualities compete against each other in most cases. So card evaluation is never as simple as making a list of every card in the game from best to worst, and when we pick our deck, we just go from the top down in the list. Right, this would make the game very boring, so I'm obviously very glad that that's not the case. Cards are designed to be played. Every card, even the worst cards, have probably some hero or some scenario playing against where you can justify them, and that's a great part about the game. Right, credit to the designers, and it's always fun to find these interesting use cases for these underplayed cards. But right, ultimately, I think efficiency is king. I know that's not really a hot take or anything, but in a world where we can make really strong decks just playing allies and resource generators, a card's efficiency really has to stand out for me in order to pull me towards playing it, even if it does come at the cost of some inflexibility or slowness. So with that, I'll conclude the first video in my 5-part deep dive strategy series. I hope this video helps you feel more empowered to make and to trust your own card evaluations, whether you're getting into the game for the first time, wanting to give a fresh look at some cards, or just looking forward to future cards. In the next video, we'll be building on the concepts in this video as we talk about hero evaluation. So I hope you'll join me for that, and bye-bye for now.